What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, May 30th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a couple short slates today, 3 games in the afternoon, 4 in the evening. Going to talk about both of them in one show because I think that's just easier than doing a show for 3 games and a show for 4. Hopefully my voice will hold up today. We won't have a repeat of yesterday. Have some water just in case. But we're going to walk through the early slate first, look at those 3 games, and then do the evening slate after that. Obviously, game theory, strategy, ownership, all of that stuff tends to play a bit bigger role on these shorter slates because it can be very difficult to build lineups that are low owned. Raw ownership on pretty much any reasonable play is going to be relatively high. You get added benefits for stacking against popular pitchers, negatively correlating your lineups in some way. So it becomes a little bit more interesting to talk about strategy-wise. Obviously, every player essentially is playable because there are only 3 or 4 games, depending on which slate we're talking about. But we'll get into all of that throughout the show. As always, throw your questions in chat. Always happy to touch on those as I see them. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. All of that stuff helps out quite a bit. Now, starting with the Oakland A's taking on the Tampa Bay Rays, we have Tyler Alexander on the mound for Tampa. Hogan Harris is going for the Rays. Both of them are sub 7K on DraftKings. Alexander coming in at 6,900 in a good strikeout matchup against Oakland. Harris coming in at 6,400 in not as good a strikeout matchup, but still a decent spot against Tampa Bay, especially in Tropicana Field, which is a favorable park for pitching. The Rays' active roster ranks 16th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching since the start of last year. They do have a 122 WRC+, so tough matchup in terms of production for Harris. The A's rank first against left-handed pitching in strikeout percentage since the start of last season at 27%. Only an 85 WRC+ there as well. We're seeing ownership come into both of these guys, and that's not surprising given that there are 6 pitchers on the slate. Alexander getting 38% ownership, Harris getting about 16. I think both are warranted. I think Harris is going a little bit under-owned just because there's 6 pitchers on the slate and he's the lowest owned, but certainly not a safe spot. He has been starting at AAA this year. He's made 8 starts. He's thrown about 29 innings. Projects to be decent in the majors. You know, most projection systems have him with like a 21 or so percent strikeout percentage, mid-4s FIP, which on this slate is perfectly fine. But again, it is a dangerous matchup against Tampa Bay. On the other side, for the season, Tyler Alexander has struck out 18% of hitters, 4.69 xFIP. He does allow some power. Obviously, he flirted with the no-hitter recently, but even that was a game where he just didn't get strikeouts and happened to have a lot of balls hit at people. So on most slates, you wouldn't really be looking at either of these guys. But on this slate, they both look fine, especially in Alexander's case, because he does have the good strikeout matchup against the A's as well. Offensively, I think both offenses are perfectly fine to get to also. Neither of these pitchers are, pitchers that you're really shying away from or that you're scared to take hitters against. And then you do also get that added benefit of both of them being relatively popular, in Alexander's case being very popular. Since the start of last season, Alexander's allowed a 211 expected ISO to righties, 193 to lefties, so it's not like he's dominant against either side. Righties this year have a 240 expected ISO against him. Lefties are at 159. So I think looking at Zach Geloff, Bretton Rooker, Shea Langoliers, those guys make sense. Rooker and Langoliers in particular, just good hitters, a lot of power. Langoliers at a weak catcher position as well. You have Miguel Andujar hitting in the middle of the lineup now also at 3,200. He looks like a good value. So don't mind getting to any of those guys. You can get to Blade and Toro as well. But Rooker and Langoliers are the ones that really stand out to me from the Oakland side. Not surprisingly, they are expected to be pretty popular, but I do think it's warranted. On the other side for Tampa, only a couple games in the majors for Harris this season, but if we go back to the start of last season, still a small sample, but a 202 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters. Lefties only a 147 expected ISO. Tampa Bay predominantly has right-handed bats. Yandy Diaz, very reasonably priced. Rosario, just look good. Now, the ownership is concerning. 37% projected ownership right now coming into Yandy Diaz. I understand it given that he is $3,900. He's leading off for the team with the highest implied run total on the slate. It looks like a good value. I assume you would be using him in cash, but it is a spot where, he looks very good, but going quite a bit over owned, showed up in 22.5% of the lineups I built. So again, optimal for me 22.5% of the time. That's a very high number. It's still not particularly close to the 36.5% ownership that he's getting. So if you are getting to Tampa, I think that finding ways around that ownership is definitely something to pay attention to. Now, one way you can do it is to just pair them with a lower owned secondary stack. But another way that I like, or that shows up for me a decent amount on shorter slates where it can be difficult to find a low owned secondary stack because they're all relatively popular, is if you were to just stack Tampa Bay without Yandy Diaz, you're already somewhat contrarian. And obviously that's not the most appealing approach because he's getting all of that ownership because he is such a good value and he does look like such a good play. But if you were to play this slate out, hundreds of thousands of times, there are plenty of times where Tampa stacks come through and Diaz doesn't have a good game. And if you happen to have, that sort of stack, you're already lowering how much you overlap with the field. And then, you can obviously go beyond that as well. If you don't have Diaz or Arozarena, you're really narrowing down how much you're overlapping with the field. So that is one approach that you can take to try and be different while still getting to what looks like the best stack on the slate in Tampa Bay. Next, we have the Cubs taking on the Brewers in Milwaukee. High scoring game last night. And today we have two very mediocre pitchers with Jameson Taillon taking on Colin Rea. Taillon projected for 39% ownership, Colin Rea at 33%. Both of those look fine here. Very, very dangerous matchup for Taillon against a Milwaukee team that has a 121 WRC plus against right-handed pitching this year. Taillon does generally pitch much better against righties than lefties. Not a great strikeout guy, but since the start of last season, he has allowed righties held righties to just a 129 expected ISO, while lefties have a 263 expected ISO against him. This year, it's been more of the same. 244 expected ISO to lefties, sub 100 allowed to righties so far this year. Colin Rea on the other side, not a very good strikeout pitcher. Has held righties to a 152 expected ISO since last year, 215 expected ISO for lefties. So we have seen both of these guys struggle with traditional splits, opposite-handed hitters doing damage against them. But just given what you have on this slate, there's not really any pitching to love. And so they are both getting ownership. They both showed up 30 to 33% of the time in the lineups that I built. So I don't think that the field is very far off, even though I have no confidence in either guy. As I mentioned, you are going to prefer left-handed bats first, given what these guys struggle with. Bryce Turang is leading off for Milwaukee. He hits left-handed. That's going to look good. Showed up in 26% of the lineups I built, 29% ownership, so pretty much in line with the field there. Then you get a bunch of Chicago bats showing up. Horner and Morel from the right side. Again, not ideal, but still priced reasonably enough, and in Horner's case with MPE, that I would expect them to show up as good plays. I think they're going a little bit under-owned. But then you get to some nice left-handed bats with Tauchman, Michael Busch, Cody Bellinger. Really liked the left-handed power from the Cubs here in not Miller Park, what used to be Miller Park, against Colin Rea. Christian Yelich is expensive, but does have that platoon advantage against Taillon. Jake Bauers looks good from the left side. Ian Happ, another left-handed bat for the Cubs that looks good. Contreras is right-handed, but an elite hitting catcher, hitting second. Happy to get to him if you can find the salary. Dansby Swanson is still cheap. He's right-handed, but we've talked about it a lot recently. Swanson started off this year hitting poorly. His expected numbers are better than his actual numbers. He has a track record of being a good hitter. I don't think there's any real reason to be particularly concerned about him. So he just looks like a pretty decent value until that price tag continues to increase. This game just looks like one where you're going to be getting to all sides of it. The pitching is popular because there's lack of alternatives. The hitting is popular because neither of the pitchers are very good, and the hitters are good in a good hitter's park. If you had to pick one side of this game, or I guess if I had to pick which side of this game I think is more likely to succeed, I think it's the offenses, just because, again, they are good, especially Milwaukee, but they are good, and the pitching is not. The problem is just, if you look at the pitching and write it off and say, well, I'm not playing Taillon against the Brewers, or I'm not playing Colin Rea against the Cubs, that's great, but you've just backed yourself into a corner where your options are now Hogan Harris, Tyler Alexander, Daniel Lynch, guys that aren't any good either. So that's why the pitching is showing up, and that's why they are good plays, for lack of a better word. But I do feel more confident in the offenses here. And you can, on a 3-game slate, I don't have any issue getting a hitter, maybe 2, against the pitcher either, because when you think about how the slate can play out, it's pretty likely that no pitcher has a great game here. And so let's say Jameson Taillon scores like 12 fantasy points. That could easily be one of the best raw scores of any of the pitchers going today. And if he scores 12 fantasy points, there's still a decent chance that he gave up a home run to Christian Yelich or something like that. Sean V mentioned that Bryce Turang will run. That's another way where if Turang just walks and then steals 2 bases, he has a good chance of being the best second base play on the slate. And he didn't even necessarily do anything to hurt Jameson Taillon. So there's no real problem with that. If I filter down to just lineups that have Jameson Taillon in them and then look at hitters, I'm not sure if this is showing up right because those numbers didn't change. It should be showing me lineups that have Turang also. I clicked on the wrong. Okay, so if we just looking at lineups that have Jameson Taillon, obviously it drives the Brewers down, but yeah, so they're not really showing up at all, which is actually very surprising to me. I think that changes. I don't know if maybe it was something in the settings when I ran lineups. I certainly personally have no issue with getting to one-offs against your pitcher on a 3-game slate. No issue with that whatsoever. So something I'm going to have to look into after the show before I build lineups, because I fully expected that to look different than it did. But yeah, adding those guys, having Turang or Yelich or Contreras or something against Taillon, there's nothing wrong with that. It's still a pretty likely pairing to succeed in the context of this slate. Finally, we have Daniel Lynch taking on Chris Paddack. $7,900 price tag for Paddack, $7,200 for Lynch, who is getting the start in place of Brady Singer, who was scratched about an hour or so ago. Lynch has spent most of this year at AAA. He's always had the potential to be decent. He is somebody that anybody that's watched my shows in the past knows that I would get in trouble rostering him frequently at cheap price tags. Was a first-round pick, got a big signing bonus, just hasn't put it together really at the major league level. Struck out 20% of hitters in 2022. At AAA this year, he has, like I said, spent most of his season there. 9 starts, 45 innings pitched, only striking out 17% of hitters. He projects for anywhere from a 16 to a 20% strikeout percentage in the majors, depending on what projection system you're looking at. Projects for a 4.2 to 4.8 FIP. It's just a pretty wide range because he probably should be better than he is. But at this point, you also have a track record of him not being that good. On this slate, we clearly, being good isn't a prerequisite for being in DFS lineups because there's arguably not a single good pitcher on this slate. So 24% ownership coming into Lynch, showed up in 32% of the lineups I built. Looks fine. I have no confidence in him, but Minnesota does have one of the lower implied run totals on the slate. They rank 11th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching since the start of last season at 22.5%, 101 WRC plus. He's fine. On the other side, Paddack is probably the most talented pitcher on this slate. 3.79 xFIP is considerably better than anybody else. 20.7% K percentage is, excluding Lynch and Hogan Harris because they've barely pitched this season. Paddack has a higher strikeout percentage than Alexander, Rhea, Taillon. He's probably the best pitcher on the slate. It's not a good strikeout matchup against Kansas City. The Royals ranked 27th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. It is an okay matchup from a run prevention standpoint. Kansas City has a 97 WRC plus. They do have Vinny Pasquantino back in the lineup, so that makes them a bit better. They no longer have Adam Frazier batting cleanup like they did yesterday for whatever reason. But yeah, Paddack just looks good. 40% ownership, 39% of the lineups I built. I think the field's pretty much spot on there. I think I like the offenses least in this game, but they're still fine. You get Kansas City going up against a 40% owned Paddack. So obviously if KC does well, you are knocking off a large portion of the field pretty much immediately. So far this season, Paddock has allowed a 227 expected ISO to righties. He has also struck them out 25% of the time. So he can get strikeouts against same-handed hitters, but it's pretty scary when you're giving up power to righties and you have Bobby Witt and Salvador Perez in the opposing lineup. Not to mention, Velasquez homered twice yesterday. Garcia can do some damage, but in particular, Bobby Witt and Salvador Perez, both very, very scary bats to be going up against. He's been better against lefties, which isn't too surprising. His best pitch, or his best secondary pitch at least, throughout his time in the majors has been his changeup. Lefties only have a 155 expected ISO against him. That's not to say that you can't go to Vinny Pasquantino. He's just a good hitter. MJ Melendez is cheap. Nick Lofton's cheap and hitting sixth. But Witt and Perez in particular, which is obvious and shouldn't be surprising to anybody, are the guys that really stand out if I were to single out individual bats going up against Paddock. On the other side for Lynch, I think just kind of getting to any of these guys makes sense. Carlos Correa at 4K going up against the lefty looks good. Good price tag there. Byron Buxton at 4,400, good price tag. So I think it's a decent matchup for Minnesota. But again, I just have an easier time making the case for either offense in the Cubs and Milwaukee game, especially in that park. In Tropicana, you have not a good hitter's park, but you have a high upside right-handed heavy lineup against Harris. And then on the other side, you do have right-handed power against a popular Alexander. So I think the offenses here are fine. I think I do prefer the KC side, but I would say this is probably my least favorite offensive game. So to recap the early slate quickly, none of the pitchers are any good. I think that Alexander and Paddock are probably the ones the field gets to the most, probably the ones I get to the most. Jameson Taillon will be popular as well. Offensively, I really like both sides of Milwaukee, Chicago, but pretty much a wide open slate where pitching is just not good. And as a result, all of the offenses look pretty decent. I don't think there's like a contrarian stack because everybody's going to be relatively popular. If we look at the hitters that I was getting most over the field on in the lineups that I built, looks like KC and Oakland, I guess, would be the contrarian ones. You do have some low ownership here at the top on guys like Melendez, Perkins, Isbell. Grabbing bottom of the order hitters is another way that you can just differentiate at least a little bit. For a home run pick, I'll take Bellinger against Colin Rea in Milwaukee. So that's the early slate. Before we move on to the late slate, a reminder that you can sign up for my package through my MLB DFS package through Dub Club using the links in the description below. You get 20% off of your first month. You get access to my MLB projections, my top stacks, top pitchers, optimal percentage, ownership, all of that stuff. $25 a month regularly, 20% off with those links. Also get access to my Discord. I hang out in there, talk strategy throughout the day. It's not meant to be as useful is not the right word, but it's not meant to be a one-stop shop where, you just start winning at DFS. I'm not promising that. I don't think it's going to happen, but it is more cost-effective for a lot of people than paying, $150, $200 a month for optimizers and sims and all of that. A lot of people are playing contests that are at price points that you shouldn't be paying that kind of money for sims and all of that. So it should make you better. Again, I'm not saying that I think I can make you the best, but I can probably make you better at a very reasonable price tag that will allow you to keep hopefully profiting on a monthly basis in DFS. Now moving on to the main slate, where apparently my lineups might not be showing up. We have a 4-game main slate. Tigers taking on the Red Sox, and this looks like it could be a problem. Tigers taking on the Red Sox, and I don't have any lineups right now. So for Detroit, we have Jack Flaherty on the mound. For Boston, we have Nick Pivetta. Two very, very good strikeout pitchers. Good strikeout matchup for Pivetta. Let's try this. Sorry about this. I had lineups built before the show, and they apparently disappeared, but I can't see the field either. Which is mostly an issue because I can't see pricing. But good strikeout matchup for Pivetta. He's been lights out in terms of getting strikeouts this year. His Stuff Plus has been fantastic. It was great in the minor leagues. It's been great so far in the major leagues so far this season. So there we go. Won't have my lineups, I don't think, but can at least see pricing now. And yeah, so Pivetta coming in at 7,800, Flaherty coming in at 8,700. They both look good. Happy to get to either one. They're both projected for plenty of ownership. 48.5% coming into Flaherty, 32% coming into Pivetta. So I like getting to both of those guys. Flaherty has been excellent this year as well. He's somebody that we, in the past, we know he's talented. He showed it when he was with St. Louis previously. Struggled a bit last year, didn't quite come through after the Orioles picked him up. But he seems to have put it back together with Detroit, striking out 33% of hitters this year, walking less than 4%, which is a big deal for him. 2.03 xFIP, just unbelievably good. Just having a great season. The Red Sox are a dangerous matchup, but they do rank 11th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching at 23% this season, 103 WRC plus. Tyler O'Neill, if I remember correctly, is also on the injured list, so that takes a scary bat out of the lineup. So I like getting the Flaherty, especially at an $8,700 price tag. I like getting the Pivetta at $7,800. The park is good for offenses, but you can see here from the implied run totals, it just speaks to how good these two pitchers are when you have a total this low in Fenway Park. So very happy to get to either pitcher. I don't anticipate getting to too much of the offenses because both pitchers are so good. Now, it is a 4-game slate, so you're going to get to more of them than you generally would given this pitching matchup. Pivetta does give up power, always has. Very good strikeout pitcher, but 219 expected ISO to lefties this year, 256 to righties. Go back to last year, 217 to lefties, 185 to righties. Fenway does play up right-handed home runs more than left-handed. So any of the Tigers, I think, from an offensive standpoint, are fine. Matt Vierling is probably the most interesting to me. 4K, third base, outfield. So should be in a good spot in the order. Has multi-position eligibility. Gets the green monster bump hitting from the right side. And he's reasonably priced. But if you get to some Wincio Perez or you get to Riley Green, who's just very good, Marcana, Torkelson, any of these guys are fine in Fenway Park. But again, you wouldn't really be getting to them on a bigger slate. You're just hoping to get a home run or two against a very popular Pivetta on a shorter slate. On the other side, same thing with Boston. I think I would rather take bats against Pivetta than against Flaherty, but there are certainly some hitters on the Red Sox that I would prefer to take over like anybody on Detroit, Rafael Devers in particular. So on a 4-gamer, obviously, if you're getting to Devers, you're getting to Duran, who can steal some bases, you're getting to a cheap Abreu, any of that stuff is fine. But very, very, very difficult matchup for both of these teams. If you had either of these pitchers on that early slate, they would be like 85% owned. So just a huge difference in talent in the first game on the main slate versus the early slate. Next, we have Arizona taking on the Mets. In New York, another game with a low total and good pitching. Zach Gallen is going for the Diamondbacks. $9,500 price tag on DraftKings, pulling about 36% ownership. Christian Scott going for the Mets at $6,900, pulling about 29% ownership. Gallen, really good pitcher. Not a lot to say about him. 26% K percentage this year, 3.27 xFIP. He's been doing it for a while. We know that he's good. The park is good for pitching. There's not a whole lot to say. The Mets, as an offense, ranked 21st in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They have a 104 WRC plus this year. So that would be like the one negative for Gallen is it's not the easiest strikeout matchup, but it certainly looks good, especially on a 4-game slate. Christian Scott, the Mets rookie, has put up solid numbers since coming up earlier this season. 22.8% K percentage, 3.93 xFIP. Not the best matchup against Arizona. They rank 19th in strikeout percentage, 94 WRC plus, but that number does probably come up. Some of their better hitters, Corbin Carroll specifically, started the season out really, really slowly. So I don't think they're actually a below average offense, even though they have been to date. But it is a reasonable price tag for Scott. Looks like a good value option. Offensively, I think this is pretty similar to that Detroit and Boston game. There's nothing about Zach Gallen that I'm looking at and saying, oh, I really like this Mets bat because he's facing Zach Gallen. But Gallen does give up some power. 173 expected ISO to lefties, 175 to righties. The park's not great for it, but it's a 4-game slate. He's going to be popular. If you want to just roll the dice on some Francisco Lindor, or if Pete Alonso is in the lineup, Pete Alonso, like any of that is fine. Alonso did leave yesterday's game early, so there is a chance that you get a bit of a watered down Mets lineup, which would obviously make Gallen look a bit better. On the other side, would certainly rather, if I have to choose a side, rather be targeting against Christian Scott than Zach Gallen, just based on we know what Zach Gallen is. Christian Scott, probably good, but obviously not as far along as proven as Gallen is. 223 expected ISO allowed to righties in a very limited sample for Scott this year, sub 100 to lefties. You'll probably see those numbers balance out, but any of the proven good Arizona bats are going to look fine. One thing that I do like about Arizona is that they are affordable. And that goes hand in hand with what I was saying before about they've been a below average offense so far this season, but they're probably not going to finish that way. Corbin Carroll is not a $4,300 DFS player. He's hit poorly to start the season, but not only do we know that he does give you power upside, he gives you stolen base upside as well, which is really nice. Ketel Marte at 4,900, don't have an issue there. But then you get another discounted bat in the middle of the order with Jock Peterson at 4K. Walker gives you a right-handed power bat against a pitcher that, again, in a limited sample, has had issues in that split so far. McCarthy is cheap and gives you stolen base upside. Gurriel gives you a right-handed power bat. Suarez gives you some right-handed power at a cheap price tag. So I do think that from a talent and salary standpoint, Arizona's really interesting. The issues are just that it is a tough matchup with Scott, and the park is not exactly appealing. Nats are taking on the Atlanta Braves in Atlanta. We have Trevor Williams going for the Nats. We have Ray Kerr on the mound for the Braves. Kerr is 5,900, projected for 16% ownership. I actually don't really know anything about him. I know he pitched recently, but 29 years old, so he's been around, not in the majors. 5 games with the Braves this year, 1 start, 27.5% strikeout percentage so far in the majors. But again, that is something that you expect to come down as a starter. In his most recent appearance, it was his first start. He went 4 innings against Pittsburgh. So I would assume that you're getting like 4 or 5 innings from this guy. It's not a great strikeout matchup against Washington, but at a cheap price tag, I don't mind getting there. He is also left-handed, which is nice to some extent. When you think about the Nats lineup, it helps to mitigate CJ Abrams, who obviously is their best player. You get the lefty-lefty matchup there. Not that Abrams can't still do damage against him, but I prefer having the platoon advantage against him as opposed to not. But overall, it's just a pricing play and a 4-game slate play. You're not going to have a lot of confidence in him, but he is really cheap. Trevor Williams on the other side, I do think is going under-owned. Right now, he's only projected for about 3.5% ownership, which just seems low. This Atlanta lineup is still very dangerous, no doubt about it, but they don't have Ronald Acuna, which just makes them weaker. And Trevor Williams has made improvements this year. It's not like he's a great strikeout pitcher now, but he has struck out 21% of hitters, 3.72 xFIP. He's consistently been pretty good this year. And while we're not short on pitching on this slate, like if this were the early slate, I think you would just be getting tons of Trevor Williams. This slate, obviously, you do have Flaherty and Pivetta and Gallen and Scott. So you're not starved for pitching. But, for example, I don't really think that whatever a Ray Kerr is should be getting 5 times the ownership of Trevor Williams. He should be more popular because he's cheaper and he has the better matchup. But I think the gap here should be smaller. So in larger field tournaments, Williams looks like one way that you potentially could differentiate a bit. Offensively, I do still like the Braves, even though Williams has been good overall this year. You just still have a lot of talent here. They're reasonably priced too, because they have been struggling a bit, not hitting all that well. Matt Olson at only 5,200 is very appealing. Williams has only allowed a 109 expected ISO to lefties this year. He's thrown a changeup to them 24% of the time. It's been effective. He hasn't given up any power on it. If you go back to last year, 175 expected ISO. So that is one spot where he has seemingly just improved, and maybe it continues going forward. But historically, he has had issues with lefties, and whether the improvements are real or not, Matt Olson's not your average lefty. So I don't really care what Trevor Williams has done against left-handed hitters in general when you talk about Matt Olson as a hitter. Austin Riley obviously gives you a lot of power. Michael Harris is still pretty cheap and should be hitting at the top of the order with no Acuna. Ozuna has been great this season. He is still pretty expensive, but Even though Williams has been better and the Braves are struggling and they lost Acuna, they do still just make sense, especially when you think about the pitching on this slate. We basically, I don't want to say wrote off, because I think you can play any of those first four offenses, but none of those first four offenses are in good spots. Even if you think that the Trevor Williams spot isn't as good this year as it would have been in years past, I think most people would agree that it's still a better matchup than facing Zach Gallen or facing Flaherty or facing Pavetta. So Braves still look pretty good to me. I don't mind getting to the Nats on the other side either. Like I said, Ray Kerr doesn't have a lot of experience as a starter. The Nats are affordably priced. They do have some solid bats, lefty for CJ Abrams, but he gives you legitimate stolen base upside in addition to his power upside. Lane Thomas is very affordable at 4,100. I like him, whether it's part of a stack, whether it's as a one-off, whatever it may be. So those two individually, I think, look pretty good. Keibert Ruiz as a value play at 2,500 is probably going to be pretty popular catcher, projected for about 19% ownership, but that's a really cheap price tag for a guy that's probably going to be batting in the middle of the order at a weak position on a short slate. So that's going to look pretty good as well. So I like both offenses here, even though Williams has made improvements. And then finally, we have the Yankees taking on the Angels in Anaheim. Carlos Rodon going for the Yankees. Patrick Sandoval going for the Angels. Two more good pitchers. Carlos Rodon has had some ups and downs this year. 22% strikeout percentage overall, 4.5 xFIP. But I talked about this on a show the other day where I didn't really think you could play Rodon, but I had brought it up just to point it out. Here, I think you can play him. The park is not great. The offense is actually pretty good, especially against left-handed pitching, going back to last season. But Carlos Rodon has started throwing his slider more going back a few starts. I believe like 5 starts now. It was the April 27th start against Milwaukee. You can see here, if you look at his first 5 starts to the season, he exceeded 18% usage on his slider once. And in his 6 most recent starts, he's been in at least 27%, about 27% in all of them. That's a pitch that gets a lot more swings and misses than his cutter, which is the pitch that you can see he essentially replaced with the slider. If you look over on this page, you can see it this season. His slider against right-handed hitters, 18.9% swinging strike percentage. His cutter had an 8% swinging strike percentage. He's allowed a 357 expected ISO on his cutter. He's allowed a 107 expected ISO on his slider. Same numbers, basically, if you go back to last season as well. So that's a pitch that, with him throwing it more, your expectation would be that he's going to get more strikeouts and he's going to be better at pitching in general. If you go into the splits tool here on FanGraphs, you go to the game where he started throwing that, you get those 6 starts, 24.5% strikeout percentage, 4.2% walk percentage, 20.4 K minus BB, 4.05 xFIP. Like, he still hasn't been pre-injury Carlos Rodon, but he certainly has made improvements. Expect the strikeout stuff to be there going forward. And so on this slate at 8,200, he looks good. He's getting 39% ownership. Looks like a good play to me. On the other side for Sandoval, very, very difficult matchup. He is a solid pitcher. His strikeout stuff is up this year. He's striking out 23% of hitters with a 3.88 xFIP. And the strikeout stuff this year is in line with previous seasons for Sandoval. So I do buy into it. I think last year was just kind of an outlier where he was pitching the contact a little bit more. The problem here is that this is a very difficult team to strike out. This is a team that, of course, has tons and tons of power against pitchers of either hand. Since the start of last season, the Yankees have a 21% strikeout percentage on their active roster against lefties, 117 WRC plus. So it's difficult to make a case for Sandoval from a matchup standpoint. I think the case would be that he's 10% owned on a 4-game slate. But even that, given the pitching on this slate, is kind of tough. Like, that's probably just where the ownership should be. It's also not a good park for pitching in. So even at a very cheap price tag, I think he might be going a little bit under owned. But when you start thinking about, other ways you can be different on the slate and other approaches you can take, it's just really tough, I think, to get to Sandoval. Kind of similar, I guess, to Trevor Williams, except getting more ownership again. Like, I think they should probably be getting similar ownership. Offensively, happy to get to the Yankees, even though Sandoval is good. Most of the pitching on this slate is good, so that kind of becomes a moot point. So far this season, righties only a 137 expected ISO against Sandoval. Same goes for lefties. Lefties have struck out 38% of the time. Righties have only struck out about 21%. So not surprising to see the lower strikeout numbers against righties. Aaron Judge, Anthony Volpe, Giancarlo Stanton all should be hitting towards the top of the order in a good park. And given their talent, they are reasonably priced. You can certainly go to Soto lefty-lefty. He's projected for about half the ownership of Aaron Judge, probably because of that. And, Aaron Judge is the better play in the given matchup, but Aaron Judge is never 2 times better than Juan Soto. Juan Soto is never 2 times better than Aaron Judge. If that ownership holds as we get closer to lock, playing Juan Soto just becomes really, really interesting from an ownership standpoint. For the Angels, again, I do think Rodon's improved. He will still give up some power, and there is some cheap power in this Angels lineup. Rengifo is reasonably priced with MPE at 4,600. Joe Adell at 3,700 has made improvements as a hitter and looks good as a value play. Plenty of upside there. Ohapi, assuming he's in the lineup at 3,800, is a good catching play, getting a little bit less ownership than Keibert Ruiz. So I like getting there. Rodon's getting a lot of ownership. I think I'll have a lot of him. But where I don't have Rodon, I do like using these Angels bats to be a little bit contrarian, get some negative correlation with the field, and also just save some salary while not giving up too much in the way of upside. So pretty much polar opposite main slate compared to the early slate where we had no good pitching. On the main slate, we have essentially nothing but good pitching. Trevor Williams and Ray Kerr are your 2 worst pitchers here, and neither of them are terrible. So I think that generally on slates like this, I think you should be willing to play stacks that you're not comfortable with because you're probably just going to see really inflated ownership coming into teams like the Yankees because they have a better matchup, but it's still not a good matchup. So it really is going to come down more so to which of these pitchers just happens to have their B stuff or C stuff today. And there's no way of knowing that. If all these guys have their A stuff, then the Braves and the Yankees are going to look the best, but none of them are going to look that good. So ownership, again, on these shorter slates, and especially on a slate like this where all the pitching is at least decent, really does play a big role. To recap the main slate, the top pitching is, all of it. But Flaherty at 8,700 looks probably the best to me. Pivetta at 7,800 looks very good. I like Rodon. I like Gallen. Scott, I think, is your best SP2 option. Offensively, the Braves and Yankees are going to look the best, but again, they are still facing quality pitchers. So do pay attention to that ownership. I think Arizona would be the team that I like getting to that probably isn't going to get as much ownership just because a lot of their offense is more talented than the pricing suggests that they are. So I do like getting to them where, they have a low implied run total, but so does every team other than the Yankees and Braves. So I think Arizona's probably my 3rd favorite team there. And not that he's contrarian, but just to reiterate, if you do see getting closer to lock a 2-to-1 ownership discount for Juan Soto compared to Aaron Judge, I'm not saying not to play Aaron Judge, but I am saying to play more Juan Soto because he's really, really good, and you should just never see that gap in ownership. So that's all I have for you. Thank you for checking out the show. Good luck on the early slate. Good luck on the main slate. Be back here at the normal noon time tomorrow to talk about the Friday slate. Thanks again. Good luck on your lineups tonight.